July 2010, a nondescript laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Nathaniel Pearson sat staring at a computer screen, his eyes widening with each line of genetic code that scrolled past. He had been analyzing DNA sequences for 15 years, had examined thousands of human genomes, had seen countless genetic variations, but he had never seen anything like this. The genome belonged to John Michael Ozzy Osbourne, the 61-year-old rock legend known as the Prince of Darkness. And according to every scientific model, every piece of medical knowledge, every understanding of human biology, Ozzy Osbourne should have been dead decades ago. Yet here he was, very much alive, asking science to explain how. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. Because this story isn't just about one rock star's DNA, it's about pushing human biology to its absolute limits, and somehow surviving. It's about a man who spent 40 years conducting an unintentional experiment on his own body, an experiment that would have killed almost anyone else. Ozzy Osbourne's substance abuse is legendary, almost mythical. It's been the subject of jokes, documentaries, and countless rock and roll stories. But the reality is far more extreme than most people understand. We're not talking about recreational drug use. We're not talking about weekend partying or occasional excess. We're talking about sustained, industrial-level consumption of alcohol and drugs over 4 decades. In interviews throughout his career, Ozzy has been remarkably honest about his consumption. In the 1970s and 1980s, during his peak years of abuse, he would drink multiple bottles of cognac per day, not glasses, bottles. He would consume vast quantities of cocaine, often going through multiple grams in a single session. He mixed alcohol with benzodiazepines, barbiturates, LSD, marijuana, and anything else he could find. His daily routine for years included waking up and immediately drinking, drinking while traveling, drinking before shows, drinking after shows, drinking until he passed out, then waking up and doing it all again. He overdosed multiple times, he had seizures, he suffered from delirium tremens, the potentially fatal alcohol withdrawal syndrome. He attempted suicide during particularly dark periods. He would go on benders that lasted for weeks, consuming substances at levels that would put most people in the hospital or the morgue. Sharon Osbourne, his wife and manager, has described finding him unconscious more times than she can count. She's described interventions, rehab attempts, medical emergencies. She's described moments when she genuinely thought he wouldn't survive the night. Medical professionals who treated Ozzy over the years were consistently shocked. They would run blood tests and see liver enzyme levels that should have indicated complete organ failure. They would see readings that suggested his body should be shutting down, yet he would bounce back, seemingly indestructible. By the time he reached his 60s, Ozzy had survived substance abuse that would have killed Keith Richards, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and countless other rock casualties multiple times over. He had outlived almost everyone who partied as hard as he did, and he wanted to know why. In 2010, Ozzy approached Clonfinnic, a Massachusetts-based genomics company that specialized in whole genome sequencing. The company, founded by cutting-edge geneticists, was at the forefront of personal genomics, the study of individual human DNA, to understand health traits and disease risk. Ozzy's request was simple but profound: sequence my entire genome and tell me how I'm still alive. The project was announced in July 2010. Media coverage was immediate and extensive. Headlines ranged from "Scientists to study Ozzy's DNA" to "Can science explain the Prince of Darkness?" The public was fascinated. Here was a rock legend submitting himself to rigorous scientific analysis. Dr. Nathaniel Pearson led the research team. In interviews at the time, he acknowledged the unique nature of the project. "We're looking at someone who has subjected his body to extreme conditions over an extended period," he explained. From a scientific perspective, this represents a rare opportunity to understand human genetic variation and resilience. The process began with a simple blood draw. From that sample, Nauma's team extracted Ozzy's DNA and began the painstaking process of sequencing his entire genome, all 3 billion base pairs that make up human genetic code. Whole genome sequencing was still relatively new technology in 2010. The Human Genome Project had only been completed in 2003. The cost and complexity of sequencing an individual's entire genome were still substantial. But for this project, Nauma dedicated significant resources. Over several months, sophisticated machines read Ozzy's genetic code, identifying every gene, every mutation, every variation.
The raw data alone was massive, gigabytes of genetic information that had to be analyzed, compared to reference genomes and interpreted. What they found was extraordinary. When Dr. Pearson and his team completed their analysis, they identified several significant genetic variations that helped explain Ozzy's unusual resilience. These weren't single mutations, but rather a collection of genetic differences that combined created a unique biological profile. First, and perhaps most importantly, they discovered variations in genes related to alcohol metabolism. Specifically, Ozzy had unusual variants of ADH4 and ALDH2 genes that control how the body processes alcohol. Here's how alcohol metabolism normally works. When you drink, your body breaks down ethanol, alcohol, through a two-step process. First, an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, ADH, converts ethanol into acetaldehyde, a toxic compound that causes many of alcohol's harmful effects. Then another enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase, ALDH, converts acetaldehyde into acetate, which is less harmful and can be eliminated from the body. In most people, this process works at a standard rate. Drink too much and acetaldehyde builds up faster than your body can process it, causing hangovers, nausea, and organ damage. But Ozzy's variants of these genes changed the equation. His ADH4 variants appeared to speed up the initial breakdown of alcohol, while his ALDH2 variants enhanced the processing of acetaldehyde. The net effect was that his body could process alcohol more efficiently than the average person. Think of it like having a faster engine and a better exhaust system in a car. He could consume more alcohol, process it more quickly, and eliminate it more efficiently. This didn't make alcohol harmless. It still damaged his body, but it meant his system could handle higher volumes without immediate fatal consequences. Dr. Pearson explained it this way in interviews. Ozzy's genetic variations don't make him immune to alcohol, but they do give him a higher tolerance and better processing capability than most people. It's like his body is equipped with industrial-strength filtration, but that was just the beginning. The research team also found variations in genes associated with addiction susceptibility. The genetics of addiction are complex and involve multiple genes, but researchers have identified several key genes that influence how likely someone is to develop addiction, how intense cravings will be, and how difficult it is to quit. Ozzy's genome showed variants in genes like COMT, which affects dopamine regulation in the brain. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. In people with certain COMT variants, dopamine processing is altered in ways that can increase addiction vulnerability. Paradoxically, Ozzy also had variants associated with risk-taking behavior and novelty-seeking personality traits linked to the DRD4 gene. People with certain DRD4 variants are more likely to engage in dangerous behaviors, seek out new experiences, and be less deterred by negative consequences. What we're seeing, Dr. Pearson noted, is a genetic profile that predisposed him to addiction and risk-taking behavior, but also gave him the physical capacity to survive behaviors that would kill most people with the same predispositions. It's a unique and somewhat paradoxical combination. The team also discovered variations in genes related to circadian rhythms and sleep. Ozzy had variants in genes like clock and PIR2, which regulate the body's internal timing system. These variations might explain his well-documented problems with sleep and his tendency toward nocturnal living, something that became obvious to millions of viewers during the Osbournes reality show. Perhaps most intriguing were variations in genes associated with cognitive function and mental health. Ozzy had variants in BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which plays a role in brain plasticity and mental health. He also showed variations in genes associated with schizophrenia risk, though he's never been diagnosed with the condition. Dr. Pearson was careful to note, having genetic variants associated with certain conditions doesn't mean you have those conditions. Genetics load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. These variants might contribute to some of Ozzy's personality traits and behaviors, but they don't define him. The research team also found something unexpected: variations in genes related to Neanderthal DNA. All humans of non-African descent carry some Neanderthal genetic material, typically about 1 to 2% of the genome. But Ozzy's Neanderthal DNA percentage was slightly higher than average, and some of those Neanderthal sequences were in genes related to immune function and metabolism. It's speculative, Dr. Pearson admitted, but it's possible that some of his Neanderthal genetic heritage contributed to his physical resilience. When the initial results were published in scientific journals and announced to the media, The response was overwhelming. News outlets around the world ran stories about Ozzy's genetic mutations. Scientific communities debated the findings, and the public was fascinated by the intersection of rock and roll legend and cutting-edge genetics. But Ozzy himself? He had a characteristically irreverent response. In interviews following the study, Ozzy joked about the findings. "I always knew I was a mutant," he laughed. "Now I've got scientific proof." But beneath the humor, there seemed to be genuine curiosity. In a more serious interview with Rolling Stone, Ozzy reflected, "It's weird to think my body is different from other people's at that level. I mean, I knew I could drink more than most people. I knew I survived things that killed my friends. But to see it in the actual DNA, that's mental, man." Sharon Osbourne had her own perspective. "I've been saying for years that Ozzy is genetically different," she told interviewers. "I've watched him survive things that should have killed him. Now we know why. He's literally built different." But she also cautioned against romanticizing the findings. This doesn't mean it's okay to abuse drugs and alcohol. Ozzy has suffered tremendously. He's dealt with addiction, health problems, guilt over friends who died. The genetic mutations helped him survive, but they didn't spare him from pain. Indeed, the study also revealed concerning findings. Despite his genetic advantages, decades of substance abuse had taken their toll. The research team found markers indicating significant past damage to his liver, though it had remarkably regenerated. They found indicators of cardiovascular stress. His brain showed signs consistent with long-term substance abuse. Ozzy's genetic mutations had helped him survive, but they hadn't made him invincible. The Ozzy genome study opened up broader discussions about genetic variation and substance abuse. Researchers began asking important questions. How many people have genetic variations that affect addiction risk? Could genetic testing help predict who's most vulnerable to addiction? Could understanding these variations lead to better treatments? Dr. Pearson and other geneticists were quick to emphasize that Ozzy's case was extreme and unique. "He represents the far end of the bell curve," Dr. Pearson explained. "Most people with these genetic variations wouldn't survive what Ozzy survived. His case involves not just genetics but also luck, medical intervention, and eventually support systems that helped him get cleaner." The study also invited comparisons to other rock legends who survived extreme substance abuse. Keith Richards, guitarist for the Rolling Stones, is perhaps the most comparable case. Richards has survived decades of heroin use, cocaine use, and alcohol consumption that rivals Ozzy's. While Richards' genome hasn't been fully sequenced publicly, medical professionals who've treated him have noted his unusual resilience. Dr. Mark Collins, who treated Richards in the 1970s, noted, "Keith has a constitution unlike anything I've seen. He should have died multiple times. There must be something genetic going on." Researchers speculated that Richards might have similar genetic variations to Ozzy: enhanced drug metabolism, higher toxin tolerance, unusual liver function. But without full sequencing, it remained speculation. Lemmy Kilmister, the late Motorhead frontman, was another legendary survivor, until his death in 2015 at age 70. Lemmy drank a bottle of Jack Daniels daily for decades, used amphetamines regularly, and maintained a lifestyle that seemed designed to test human limits. His doctor once famously said Lemmy's blood was so unusual that it would likely be toxic to transfuse into another person. Compared to these legends, Ozzy's genetic study provided actual scientific data. It transformed rock and roll mythology into biological fact. But the study also raised ethical and social questions. Some addiction specialists worried that publicizing Ozzy's genetic advantages might encourage dangerous behavior. "We don't want people thinking they might have these mutations and deciding it's safe to abuse substances," warned Dr. Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Others saw it as an opportunity for education. "Understanding genetic variation in drug metabolism and addiction can help us develop better prevention and treatment strategies," argued Dr. Howard Schaefer, a Harvard addiction researcher. Ozzy's case, while extreme, provides valuable data. The genetic testing company 23andMe even began offering limited genetic testing for addiction-related variants, though they emphasized that genetics is only one factor among many in addiction risk. Following the initial study, Ozzy continued to be monitored periodically. Additional analyses in subsequent years revealed more details about his genetic profile. Researchers found variations in genes related to pain perception, potentially explaining his high pain tolerance. They found variants affecting his immune system, possibly why he rarely got sick despite his lifestyle. In 2019, nearly a decade after the original study, Dr. Pearson and his team published a follow-up paper examining how Ozzy's body had changed over time. Despite years of being relatively sober, though never completely clean, his body showed remarkable recovery in some areas while bearing permanent damage in others. His liver function, which had been severely compromised in the past, had improved dramatically. The liver's regenerative capacity, enhanced by his genetic advantages, had allowed significant healing. His cardiovascular system showed less improvement. Years of stimulant abuse had left permanent effects. Most concerning was evidence of neurological changes. By 2019, Ozzy was dealing with Parkinson's disease and the effects of multiple falls and injuries. His brain showed signs of damage consistent with long-term substance abuse and physical trauma. The genetic mutations that helped him survive hadn't prevented all consequences. They had given him more time, but time eventually catches everyone. Ozzy's own reflection on his genetic legacy has evolved over the years. In his 2010 autobiography, I Am Ozzy, he wrote about feeling simultaneously blessed and cursed by his constitution. Part of me wishes I'd been more like normal people, that I'd gotten sick sooner, that my body had forced me to stop before I lost so many years to addiction. But he also acknowledged the strange gift it represented. I got to live through things that killed better people than me. I got more time with my family. I got to make more music. I guess in a weird way I'm lucky. Sharon has spoken about watching Ozzy age, and how his genetic advantages seem to be fading. The mutations helped him survive his younger years, she told an interviewer in 2022. But now he's in his 70s, and age is the one thing genetics can't fully protect you from. The scientific community continues to reference Ozzy's case in research papers and genetics discussions. His genome has become a teaching tool in some university genetics courses, an example of extreme genetic variation and its real-world implications. Dr. Pearson, who led the original study, reflected on the project's impact. Ozzy's case demonstrated that genetic variation in humans is far more extensive and consequential than we sometimes appreciate. We're all carrying unique genetic profiles that affect everything from how we process medications to our risk for diseases. Ozzy's case just happens to be more extreme and frankly more entertaining than most. Other researchers have used the Ozzy study as a springboard for broader investigations into addiction genetics. Several ongoing studies are examining genetic variations in recovering addicts, trying to identify factors that influence recovery success. Others are looking at genetic variations in indigenous populations that have been exposed to alcohol for fewer generations, trying to understand how evolutionary time affects substance metabolism. The pharmaceutical industry has shown interest as well, understanding how Ozzy's genetic variants enhance drug metabolism could potentially inform the development of medications for overdose treatment or addiction recovery. Some researchers are exploring whether therapies could be developed to temporarily enhance drug metabolism in overdose situations. But beyond the science, Ozzy's genetic study touched something deeper in popular culture. It provided a biological explanation for a legend, a scientific foundation for rock and roll mythology. It answered a question people had been asking for decades. How is Ozzy Osbourne still alive? The answer wasn't magic or divine intervention or pure luck. It was genetics. Boring, beautiful, complex genetics. Random mutations inherited from his parents who inherited them from their parents, going back through generations. Variations in his DNA that probably didn't matter much for his ancestors working in factories in Birmingham, but that became crucial when their descendant decided to become a rock star. In a way, the study humanized Ozzy while simultaneously making him seem more extraordinary. He wasn't invincible. He was just unusually well equipped for a lifestyle that shouldn't be survived. Today, at 75 years old, Ozzy continues to live with the consequences and advantages of his genetic profile. He's largely sober now, not by choice initially but by necessity, as his body could no longer handle the abuse. He takes numerous medications for Parkinson's and other health issues. He moves slowly, speaks with difficulty sometimes, and deals with chronic pain from decades of physical punishment. But he's still here, still making music occasionally, still spending time with his family, still defying expectations, albeit in different ways now. His genome sits in databases, anonymized but still available for research. Future scientists studying human genetic variation will encounter those sequences, possibly without knowing whose they are, and note the unusual combinations of variants. Perhaps someday, Ozzy's genetic legacy will contribute to treatments that help addiction sufferers, or medications that work better for people with similar genetic profiles, or understanding of how human bodies can be pushed to extremes, or perhaps his real
legacy is simpler, a reminder that we're all walking around with 3 billion base pairs of genetic code that make us who we are, that influence everything from our eye color to how we process alcohol, to our risk-taking behavior. We're all genetic experiments, testing the limits of what our particular DNA allows. Ozzy just happened to get a combination that let him test those limits more extremely than almost anyone else in human history. "I'm a mutant," Ozzy said when the study results came out, grinning that familiar impish grin. "Always knew I was special." He was joking, but the science suggests he was right. At a fundamental molecular level, Ozzy Osbourne is built differently than almost anyone else on Earth. His DNA contains variations that gave him advantages most people don't have. Not superpowers exactly, but close enough. And that's why, when you ask how is Ozzy Osbourne still alive, the answer is more fascinating than any rock and roll legend. He's alive because billions of years of evolution, thousands of generations of human variation, and pure random genetic chance created a person whose body could survive things that would kill almost anyone else. He's alive because his DNA says so. Science has finally explained the Prince of Darkness, and the answer is as extraordinary as the man himself.